We've got James Hollins and Elizabeth Arnot, two experts from TDI today to talk you through everything, which is going to be really great. They'll be talking for around 45 minutes together, and then there'll be question and answers at the end for you. So please feel free to pop your questions in the chat or the Q&A box as we go through the session, and we'll do our best to make sure that everything's covered. And there'll be a couple of polls throughout the session, so feel free to answer. I think there's one there at the moment, which people are answering, so that's really lovely to get a sense of it. And if you want to let us know where you're calling in from, that's always really interesting for us too. So thank you. The other information to let you know is that we'll be sharing a recording of this webinar within the week or so following. And there'll be a few slides available for download, and we also transcribe all TDI webinars so that you've got maximum accessibility. So keep an eye out on social, make sure you're following us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, and you'll be able to find the notification there when those things are ready for you to access. So in the meantime, I think we've got fairly good attendance already, and we have lots of people signed up today. So I'll let James and Elizabeth introduce themselves and get started. So maybe James, we'll hand over to you.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Agnes. So it's great to see so many participants on this call talking about the CSDDD. My name's James Hollins. I'm one of the senior managers here at TDI. I've spent the last 12, 13 years within supply chains and conducting supply chain due diligence throughout the world, traveling all over the world, conducting audits, both as a lead environmental auditor and a specialist human rights auditor. I've joined TDI about 6 months ago, and I head up the data and due diligence side for TDI. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Ignis. Thanks, James. So yes, my name is Elizabeth Arnot. I'm a consultant with TDI, and I specialize in responsible mining practices, and in particular, mining policy and regulation in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm in the final stages of completing my PhD at the University of Manchester's School of Law, where my research has focused on the development of ASM regulation and the relationship between mining regulation and voluntary standards. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks guys very much. I was just going to say it's nice to look through the poll and see that we've got a fairly good split between people who feel they've already got existing supply chain due diligence stuff in place, and most people seem to feel that some changes will be needed to their existing procedures. So it will be interesting to see how people feel about that at the end as well, whether that lasts through. So Elizabeth's going to kick us off today, and I hope everyone enjoys the session, and please feel free to make sure that you ask any questions that you have as we go through. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ignis. Yeah, so we just thought that it would be interesting to go through a little bit of the history of due diligence. So due diligence really emerged as something that was in many ways purely voluntary, and we saw due diligence grow into different voluntary standards for specific sectors. So as you can see here, the Ethical Trading Initiative, EITI is another really common one that people are familiar with. And then the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights came along in 2011. And this really paved the way for due diligence pertaining to corporate conduct and human rights. However, at the time when it emerged, it was really more of a soft law mechanism, meaning that it wasn't binding of human rights under these principles. But since then, the regulations have been growing in Europe, which really turned soft law into hard law, meaning due diligence requirements have increasingly become enshrined into legislation by the EU and throughout European countries individually. So here you can see that evolution visualized a little bit, highlighting the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive of 2014, the UK Modern Slavery Act of 2015, to the more recent Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the German Supply Chain Act, and then what we're going to be focusing on today, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is commonly known as the CSDDD, or the Directive, more commonly known as, yeah. So here we see another visualization of the way in which European countries have been gradually moving towards the adoption of due diligence laws. So Germany, Norway, France, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the UK have all adopted due diligence regulations, meaning that companies headquartered within these countries, or sometimes just doing business operations within these countries, can be held liable for adverse human rights and environmental impacts, obviously depending on the specification of each piece of legislation. And then we see the way that each country has kind of been gradually moving towards that throughout the EU. Yeah. So then here we have one last visualization that really demonstrates the evolving compliance landscape and kind of where things have been moving even beyond the European landscape in North America as well.
I think before we go into the requirements of the CSDDD, this is an important quote from Professor John Ruggie. If you know the UN Guiding Principles, Business and Human Rights, you know he created them. They are also known as the Ruggie Principles. And this was in relation to the CSDDD and saying what Elizabeth just talked about with the evolution from soft law to hard law. Really, the EU, as the world's largest trading bloc, has a golden opportunity to provide authoritative standards, which inevitably would have international spillover effects. As we go through the requirements, you'll see how the UNGP, the United Nations Guiding Principles, are fundamental to the CSDDD from a due diligence perspective, as well as the OECD guidelines. So let's go into it, and we'll talk about what the requirements are in terms of purpose and scope for the CSDDD. So really, what does the directive do? The directive requires EU member states to transpose international law a corporate due diligence duty to identify, prevent, bring to an end, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights and environmental impacts. The duty would apply to a company's own operations, not only its own operations, but where it goes above and beyond other due diligence, it's looking at subsidiaries and its entire value chains. So it is all encompassing. What is the goal of the directive? Essentially, the directive aims to ensure that companies active in the EU internal market contribute to sustainable development and the transition to sustainable economies through the identification, prevention, and mitigation, cessation, and minimization of these risks that we've been talking about, the potential and adverse human rights and environmental impacts, which are connected with a company's own operations, subsidiaries, and value chains. What I'll say here is it's an instrumental piece of legislation aimed at compelling both domestic and international companies operating within the European Union to take accountability for their environmental and social impacts, inclusive of those generated in its supply chain. So it's not just your own operations, it is your entire value chains as well. So the directive will mandate these corporations in scope, and we will talk about what's in scope and what's out of scope on upcoming slides. But the directive is mandated that these corporations identify, mitigate, and prevent these actual risks occurring. Let's go to the next slide and talk about who is affected. So this is really important because not everyone is impacted by the CSDDD. It's broken down into two groups. Group one, which we'll refer to here as the first group, is EU companies with a turnover of 150 million euros. That's worldwide turnover, and over 500 employees. These are essentially companies operating in non-high impact sectors. We'll talk about the high impact sectors on the following slide, but these are non-high impact sector companies. Group two, so these are EU companies operating in high impact sectors. The threshold has been lowered because there is significantly more risk. So the thresholds for group two EU companies is a 40 million net turnover worldwide, and 250 employees. So as you can see, it's a significantly lower threshold. These operating, it does apply to non-EU companies as well, operating in the EU markets. So in terms of non-EU companies, it's 150 million euro turnover within the EU. So this is difference is it's not a worldwide turnover, it's the EU turnover of 150 million euros specific to the EU. And then group 2, again, the threshold's lower, but it's 40 million euros turnover within the EU market. And what I'll say is an employee test is not required for non-EU companies. So these non-EU companies do not have an employee test. So the 500 plus employees, that applies only to EU companies, or the 250 for group 2 companies is non-applicable to non-EU companies. So yep, this is who is affected. And as I said, in terms of group 1 and group 2, it is split into high impact sectors. So what is a high risk sector? This is where your threshold is lowered to the group 2 stage. Sorry. There's 3 key high impact sectors. The first one really is revolving around the textile and fashion world. So it's the manufacture of textiles, leather and related products, including footwear, and the wholesale trade of textiles, clothing and footwear. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's the textile and fashion world, which is considered higher risk here. And you would fall under group 2. The second one, which falls under group 2, is agriculture, forestry and fisheries, including aquaculture, the manufacture of food products, and the wholesale trade of agricultural raw materials, live animals, wood, food and beverages. So that's the second group that falls into group 2. And then third and final is the extraction of mineral resources, regardless of where in the world it is extracted. So this includes crude petroleum, natural gas, coal, lignite, metals and metal ores, as well as other non-metallic minerals and quarry products. So there's a very broad range of things that fall under this category. It is also the manufacture of basic metal products, other non-metallic mineral products and fabricated metal products. The exception here is machinery and equipment does not fall under this category. That is separate. It does not fall under group 2 within this section. And finally, the wholesale trade of mineral resources and basic intermediate mineral products, including metals, metal ores, construction materials, fuels, chemicals, and other intermediate products. In terms of estimated number of companies who are affected with the CSDDD, there is a significant number of companies who are going to be impacted and have to comply. Essentially, it's estimated around 13,000 EU companies will fall under these requirements and another 4,000 third country companies. In terms of these third country companies, a significant number of these are actually US subsidiaries operating in Europe. So there's around 17,000 companies total. Of these 4,000 third country companies, so those majority US subsidiaries, 2,600 non-EU companies are in group 1 and 1,400 non-EU companies are within the group 2 higher risk sectors. Of the 13,000 EU companies, around 9,400 EU companies fall under the category 1. So the lower impact, the lower risk sector, and the remaining fall under the higher risk sectors. So a significant number of companies will be impacted by the rollout of the CSDDD.
So now let's turn and look at the specific coverage of the directive. So what are the adverse human rights impacts covered by the directive? So the directive very broadly looks to protect human rights. And this contrasts with many other corporate human rights laws, which historically have tended to focus on forced labor and child labor or very specific issues. So an adverse human rights impact would be an adverse impact on a protected person resulting from the violation of one of the 22 foundational human rights instruments that are listed in the annex. So a few examples of those, and this is not exhaustive, Indigenous people's rights to the lands, territories, and resources they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired, the prohibition of human trafficking, the prohibition of all forms of slavery, practices akin to slavery, serfdom, other forms of domination or oppression in the workplace, the right to enjoy just and favorable conditions of work, which includes a fair wage, a decent living, safe and healthy working conditions, and reasonable limitations on working hours, and the prohibition of employment of children under the age at which compulsory schooling is completed, which is generally not less than 15 years of age. Yeah. And then when we see the adverse environmental impacts covered, this is a little bit more narrow in range of harms than the human rights component of the directive. And these are related to one of 12 specific environmental conventions, which among other things pertains to the biological diversity and endangered species, manufacturing, such as the use of mercury, production and use of persistent organic pollutants, the handling, collection, storage, and disposal of waste, the importation of hazardous chemicals, the production and consumption of specific substances that deplete the ozone layer, and exporting and importing of hazardous waste. So these are just some examples that are covered. So now let's look at what happens if a company that is in scope of the regulation doesn't comply. So first, there's civil liability, which is covered in Articles 22, 23, and 27. So companies that are in scope face civil liability for failure to conduct due diligence on the impact of their operations on human rights and environmental risks of their value chains, and when they fail to take adequate action to prevent or mitigate any identified adverse impacts. So it's not enough to just identify them. You have to actually be taking preventative action as well. So the 4 conditions for a company to be held liable include damage caused to a natural or legal person, a breach of duty, a causal link between the damage and the breach of duty, and a fault, which could be intentional or just through negligence. This covers that as well. So then we have the director's duty of care. So this is covered in Articles 25 and 26. So under the Commission's current proposal, a director's duty of care to act in the company's best interest would be expanded to take into account, where applicable, human rights, climate change, and those environmental consequences. And this means that member states would be required to ensure that laws, regulations, and administrative provisions providing for a breach of directors' duties applies to those duties. Directors would specifically be responsible for establishing and overseeing their due diligence systems. So in particular, directors would be responsible for a due diligence policy with due consideration for relevant input from stakeholders and civil society organizations wherein they operate. So sanctions. Under the directive, member states would be required to establish rules or sanctions in the event of a violation of national provisions adopted pursuant to this directive. So the sanctions are at this stage, they're required to be effective, proportionate, and the determining factors for this include efforts to comply with any remedial action required, investments and targeted support provided to address the impacts, and the collaboration with other entities to address impacts. So these are things that would be considered when looking to sanctions. And it should be noted as well that if sanctions are imposed, this has to do with a company's turnover. So this has to do with the revenue of a company as well.
Yeah, just in relation to that point, it's similar to how the GDPR regulations, general data protection regulations, for companies are administered currently. So if you're familiar with GDPR and how companies are fined against that, it's a similar approach in terms of the company's turnover is taken into account when sanctions are applied. In terms of the due diligence, so let's really go to the due diligence aspect. It's really important to note that the due diligence is generally aligned with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which we've talked about. So you saw at the beginning of the slides, the soft law, the voluntary nature. These are two frameworks which are voluntary and soft law. And what's really happening here is the CSDDD is becoming mandatory and being put into legislation. And actually the UN guiding principles and the OECD multinational enterprises is becoming hard law, essentially, when it comes to the due diligence part. And essentially, what is the directive trying to achieve with the due diligence? At a high level, this due diligence consists of the following 7 actions. You're required to integrate due diligence into policies. You're identifying actual or potential adverse impacts within your value chain. You're preventing and mitigating potential adverse impacts. So it's not just a case of, as Elizabeth said, identifying it. You are preventing and mitigating these impacts as well. You're required to bring actual adverse impacts to an end and minimize their extent. Establishing and maintaining a complaints procedure. So that's a grievance process for employees throughout the value chain. And monitoring the effectiveness of due diligence policy and measures taken. So it's not just simply a case of having these in place. You are required to monitor the effectiveness of your audit schemes, of however you are conducting these due diligence processes, and ensuring that your value chain partners are complying. And then finally, it's publicly communicating on due diligence. What I will say is, if you're familiar with the CSRD, the Corporate Social Reporting Directive, there is no additional reporting requirements when it comes to the CSDDD for publicly communicating. So it is entirely in line with the CSRD, and we'll talk about that later on. Ooh. Okay, so the important details, the niche areas here. What is referred to as a value chain? We keep talking about this value chain. I think it's important to note that a company's value chain would include both upstream and downstream activities. So it's not just your operations, it is your upstream and downstream activities. And the value chain would be defined in the directive to include activities related to the production of goods or the provision of services by a company, including the development of the product or services and use and disposal of the product, as well as the related activities of upstream and downstream established business relationships. So really this construct is intended to cover all aspects of a value chain. The upstream, established direct and indirect business relationships that design, extract, manufacture, transport, typically store and supply the raw materials. But also covered downstream relationships, which are intended to include established direct and indirect business relationships, which typically are dealing with products or services from a company up to end of life. So this includes the distribution of the product to retailers, the transport and the storage in warehouses of the product, the dismantling of the product, and its recycling. So it is full to end of life from upstream and downstream. So it is the entire value chain. And when we talk about established business relationships, I think there is important details here to discuss. A business relationship would be a relationship with a contractor, a subcontractor, or any other legal entity. So a business relationship would be an established business relationship if it is expected to be lasting in view of its intensity or duration and does not represent negligible or merely ancillary part of the value chain. So it's this relationship can be direct or indirect, and the guidance really is to be checking your business relationships periodically, at least every 12 months, to ensure that business relationships that previously weren't haven't just become it, because you would have to conduct monitoring on that as well. So really, when we're talking about due diligence, does it differ between these two groups? No, essentially the requirements for group 1 and group 2 due diligence is the same. The thresholds are obviously slightly different, but the actual due diligence process and what is required does not change between group 1 or group 2. It's simply a case that the thresholds for group 2 is lower, and they are required to comply with a lower turnover and less employees if they are operating in the EU. And for non-EU companies, an EU turnover of 40 million euros. So let's talk about steps for compliance. This is key as to what is required to be done in regards to compliance with the CSDDD. And the first part is integrating due diligence into companies' policies. You must have a due diligence policy containing the company's approach to due diligence activities and the corresponding process for implementing the activities. A code of conduct will be required, including rules to be followed by employees and subsidiaries. And that has to be communicated out to them as well. It's not a case of you developing them and not communicating them so they don't know about it. It's a requirement that they know about it, and the communication is really important here. These policies really ideally in best practice should be updated at least every 2 years. So really once you've created the policies, the next aspect is really looking at risk and performing risk analysis to identify actual and potential adverse impacts. So we keep talking about these actual and potential adverse impacts. And what this is essentially risk analysis. So you should take appropriate measures to identify actual and potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts arising from your operations and your supply chains operations. And as Elizabeth mentioned, there are 22 fundamental human rights which fall under this category. It is non-exhaustive. These have not changed in terms of these follow international frameworks as to violations of human rights, and the 12 environmental impacts as well are following international frameworks for what a violation of an environmental impact is as well. So it's worth knowing what these are because the risk analysis is really key to identifying if you're causing these risks in your value chains. So number 3, so preventing, ceasing, or minimizing actual and potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts. Essentially here, a company is required to develop and implement a prevention action plan. Through this, there are numerous mechanisms, seeking contractual assurances from direct business partners, covering your policies and codes of conduct in step 1, and making the necessary investments in order for these to be compliant. So making sure your value chain partners are complying with your policies and procedures. And as well, within the CSDDD, providing targeted and proportionate support for SMEs, particularly smaller businesses, in order to comply with this. It is a process of supporting these SMEs with the company which you've established. So the requirements are quite strict, and compliance is going to be, relatively tough. It is about supporting smaller businesses as well through this, who may well be your suppliers, or you may well be a supplier to a bigger business. So that's really important here. Number 4 is fundamentally looking at established channels for communication and how affected parties can communicate if there is risks directed at them. This is normally through a formal grievance mechanism, which is fundamental to the UNGP. And this is really about establishing a formal grievance process within your value chains to ensure that if risks are occurring, the relevant channels are there to facilitate the knowing of these risks. And then number 5, this really is looking at monitoring the effectiveness of due diligence policies and measures. Often this is done through an audit approach and an on-site due diligence assessment. And this is really required to ensure that your processes previous to step 5s are effective. So there are requirements to ensure that you are monitoring the effectiveness of your due diligence procedures and policies, and making sure that suppliers are following your codes of conduct and the policies you've developed. And then finally, number 6, it's about the communication of due diligence. So as I said, the directive does not introduce any new reporting obligations in addition to the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. They are entirely aligned, but there is a requirement for reporting, and this would be integrated into your reporting processes. Key tips. So some of the really difficult aspects when these are, your due diligence programs are being developed. The first one really is about developing effective grievance mechanisms, which relates to step 4 that we've just talked about, the complaints process. Making sure it's in a language in terms of the correct language, designed for the right level, and there's no technology barriers for rights holders to assess the complaints and ensuring they're addressed correctly. They're really important factors in a grievance process. Consider how you obtain contractual assurance that suppliers are meeting your expectations and requirements. So you putting contractual clauses in place to cease and prevent these risks is really important. Going back to civil liability, failure to fulfill the obligations can result in civil liability. And this is for your subsidiaries and direct and indirect suppliers as well. So this is really important. This is unique to the CSDDD in terms of civil liability. There is a potential for victims of human rights abuses and environmental impacts to take companies directly to the member states' courts. And when Elizabeth was talking about sanctions, that is an avenue for victims of these impacts to take civil liability against a company. And again, going back to when fulfilling their duty to act in the company's best interest, directors must take into account the consequences of their decision for sustainability matters, including in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And here, sort of at TDI, we've developed a nice sort of framework for how you can create a due diligence approach to complying with the CSDDD. And this really does need to be quite robust. So let's start with number 1, risk identification and assessment. What I will say here is sort of due diligence is dynamic. It's an ongoing process. It involves continuous assessments. It is not simply a static tick box exercise. This needs to be ongoing and continuous. So when it comes to risk identification, a risk-based and proportional approach is essential for a company to demonstrate that it's effectively protecting all rights holders within the value chain and ensuring that no abuses are occurring. The key is ongoing risk management. We essentially need to move past this notion of due diligence as an annual static box ticking practice. Instead, it should be continuous and a robust process with established environmental and social frameworks within. Number 2, commitment and governance. Your company's commitments to sustainability should not be just a statement. It should be a set of clearly defined policies backed up with access to risk experts who can design this for you, and the establishment of appropriate governance models. This is about creating an organizational structure that is capable of coping with the challenges of sustainability. Number 3, so integration, communication, and training. Essentially, this is the integration of the findings of risk and your commitment to mitigating these risks. So any findings from assessments that you've developed and policy requirements should be integrated into existing risk and due diligence processes and systems. So creating robust management systems for this. I would say don't stop there. It's really crucial to communicate expectations to key internal and external stakeholders. The communication is key, getting all your suppliers on board, training relevant stakeholders to uphold commitments, to conduct due diligence of their own and activities. It's equally critical because you are relying on your suppliers as well to be compliant. And this is really important. You know, it's taking an approach where you all need to be on board through your value chain to ensure these risks and abuses are not occurring. Number 4, sort of the compliance tracking and response. Monitoring and enforcement programs such as audits should be set up, implemented to track compliance, but having people, resources and mechanisms to effectively respond when issues arise is equally important. So it's not just about audit. There are many alternative channels as well here. And where necessary, the action should be taken to cease, prevent, mitigate these risks. So taking into account these contractual obligations that you will have in contracts as well to cease if these risks are occurring. Number 5, the grievance handling and remediation. Again, we've talked about it as being a really key point here and how it has to be accessible to all rights holders. The key points being that it's accessible for all workers, regardless of literacy, and there should be no technology barriers here. And this really feeds into the overall, how are you communicating this in your reporting and review mechanisms? So regularly having management reporting, stakeholder communications, that should be carried out. But remember, due diligence itself, it's not a destination, it's a journey, and you really need to be changing your approaches, modifying them as you're getting more information throughout this process, and regularly reviewing the learnings and adjusting for continuous improvement is very important to an effective due diligence framework. It is not static. As I mentioned, it has to be a dynamic approach. Pass over to Elizabeth on
Yeah.
risks.
So as somebody who works to advocate for small scale producers in law and regulation, I always think that it's important to kind of look at the other angle of the laws that are coming in place. And so with this regulation in particular, as has been explained by James, companies will be expected to go into their value chains beyond their direct operations, which means beyond their tier 1, firsthand suppliers. And often at the beginning of value chains, particularly the complex ones, such as the mineral, textile, and agricultural value chains, that is where we find the most vulnerable value chain actors, who are often operating small scale and may also be working informally. And this presents a risk that companies will disengage from small scale producers as they are perceived as riskier suppliers, instead of actually taking the steps to engage them, which is really what the directive intends to encourage. But a continued pattern of this would ultimately lead to the exclusion of some of the most vulnerable value chain actors from the European market. So this is definitely something to kind of keep eye on as things progress from my perspective anyways. So what should companies be doing? So yeah, I'm sure at this point you're wondering, what do we do now? So first and foremost, at a minimum, companies should be assessing whether they are likely to come in scope of the directive. And if so, they should continue to monitor the status of the directive. Secondly, potentially affected companies should consider conducting a high-level preliminary gap assessment to provide a directional sense of the amount of work that would be required to comply with the directive's requirements. And third, and this needs to be highlighted, the ultimate terms and timing of the final directive will be what determines companies' compliance obligations when those begin. However, companies should take a flexible approach to new or enhanced policies and procedures to accommodate for these future requirements. So here is just a little example. So going back to point number 2 in terms of what companies can be doing to prepare, it's important to really be doing these types of analyses within your companies to understand what is going to be applicable and to compare your management systems against the directive that is coming up to understand what needs to be done to ensure that you will indeed comply. So this is just a quick snapshot of something that I did, which compares a number of regulations, not limited to the EU. We also see North American regulations in there as well. And so we often do these types of analyses for companies, and then we'll compare them against their management systems or against their jurisdictions, even just the simple step of understanding if it's a very large company operating in multiple jurisdictions, what applies where and how can a company demonstrate compliance. So this is always a good kind of activity as a first step for companies to be doing if they feel like they are unprepared or are unsure of whether they are meeting the directive's requirements. Yeah.
I know we've got about 18 minutes left. I was just going to answer some commonly asked questions before we delve into any of your questions. I think the first one, is the directive currently legally binding? The Commission has adopted the directive, however, it's not yet in effect. So there is no current legal obligations at the moment. It is going through the EU's tripartite system in terms of the EU Commission, the EU Parliament and the EU Council. They all have to agree it, and then it gets transposed into the 27 member states. That is expected to happen this year. And as a result, when is compliance required? So if that aspect does happen this year, Group 1 companies that we've talked about, the 150 million turnover with 500 employees, you will have 2 years after the directive enters into force. So if that happens this year in 2023, you will have until 2025 to comply. Group 2, the higher risk sectors, the mining, the agriculture, and the fashion and textiles will have an additional 2 years beyond 2025. So we're talking 2027 at the earliest for the higher risk sectors. So this is not immediate, but there should be some certainly plans to prepare for this because it is significantly more strict than other due diligence legislation, which certain EU countries have. This goes above and beyond any currently. As we mentioned, does the directive relate to the EU non-financial reporting directive, so the CSRD? It's intended to complement the current CSRD and its proposed amendments by adding substantive requirements to perform due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for external harm resulting from adverse human rights and environmental impacts within the entire operations. So this is entirely complementary, and it's been designed to complement the CSRD. I think one question as well, which is really important, particularly with changes to the Uyghur Forced Labor Act the last few weeks, and how developments in the US have been taking place. This is slightly different at the moment in terms of, is it comparable to that sort of legislation that the US has? The directive does not ban importing into the European products produced with forced labor. This is expected to be addressed into separate EU legislation. The EU Forced Labor Act is potentially looking at that avenue. However, forced labor would be an adverse human rights impact that Elizabeth talked about earlier. It would be covered by the due diligence requirements of the directive, so the sanctions and the fines certainly can be applied for some of these high-risk industries with forced labor, which is prominent in some of these higher impact sectors. Okay, so in terms of the presentation, that's everything. If you have any questions that we don't cover in the next 15 minutes, we're happy for you, obviously, to contact us. You will get a copy of the So this is being transcribed, and we'll upload it onto our social media channels. Alternatively, my email and Elizabeth's email are there. If you want to send us an email, if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them as well. I will stop sharing my screen and over to you, Agnes, in terms of questions.
Firstly, I just want to say a big thanks to both of you, because that was incredibly comprehensive, and I feel like I've learned a lot just in the last 45 minutes. Thank you. We've got quite a few questions come in. Some of them might have been touched on latterly from them being entered, but it would be good just to make sure we've got everything covered there. So we've got one here. If your company belongs to Group 1 requirements, but is also a subsidiary, does the CSDDD then still apply to you?
Yeah, if you breach the thresholds of Group 1, then yes.
Another one, do you know if the UK is planning to implement something similar, or would the UK be affected by these legislations?
That's a really good question. I'll let Elizabeth answer as well, but from my side, for UK companies operating in the EU, for non-EU companies, Group 1, the thresholds still apply to UK companies. You fall under the non-EU category. In terms of adoption, there are plans there are talks in terms of taking what the EU CSDDD is doing and applying it to a UK perspective. Regardless of that, you are required to comply if you fall in the non-EU categories anyway for Group 1 and Group 2. So there are UK companies operating in the European markets which will have to be compliant anyway because of their turnover in the EU market.
Elizabeth, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that answers it. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So this one you did touch on, but again, it might be good to elaborate. Do OECD principles and guidelines applicable to European companies and businesses? Are they applicable to European companies and businesses only? And why do Chinese companies that don't necessarily comply to them, especially in oil and gas and rare earth minerals, why are they not being, I guess the question is asking why they're not being applied in the same way to the OECD principles, and is there any impact and crossover there?
Yeah, so I'll provide my input first. Elizabeth, if you have anything to add on to it. The OECD guidelines are voluntary in terms of aspects to it, as well as the UN guiding principles, the due diligence aspects. This is really taking that and making it hard law. So there are legislative impacts now. Your subsidiaries or your value chains within China and high-risk sectors there are within the scope of the CSDDD. And particularly aspects like forced labor in Xinjiang, this is really being looked at with the CSDDD and making sure that there is compliance there. So really it is a case of actually these suppliers and your partners there, you will have to ensure they're compliant with the requirements, particularly as forced labor is one of the fundamental human rights breaches. So it is taking that and taking it to the next level, saying that if you aren't ensuring these risks are mitigated, there will be sanctions on the company.
Elizabeth, was there anything?
Yeah, no. I think just to reiterate what James said around the OECD principles and guidelines are a soft law mechanism, as we would call them, but they've been enshrined into legislation in Europe, right? So if there's a Chinese company that is operating in Europe, this would apply directly to them. But through this directive, if there is a company operating in Europe that has relations with the Chinese company in their value chain, then it will still be applicable to them. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Got a very far-reaching remit in terms of that aspect.
It does.
Great. So we've got a question here that says, we have set up our supply chain policy, I expect this might apply to a few people, and procedure based on OECD due diligence guidelines for minerals, plus we added environmental risks to Annex 2. What are the key changes we need to think about to be in line with the DDD?
Elizabeth, do you want to go first?
I mean, I guess that's a bit of a tricky one, because it is something that I think for us to make a full assessment of, we would need to have a little bit more information in terms of what is actually going on in your company. That would be my first reaction to a question like that. But in terms of following those kind of 6 steps that James elaborated on, which do find their foundation in the OECD due diligence guidance, it does sound like you're on the right path. But yeah, I feel like we need more information.
I think there's a key difference here as well between policy commitments and actually ensuring it's implemented throughout your value chains. You can have very deep and complex policies which address all of your risks. That doesn't mean that actually your value chains and your suppliers and your partners are adhering to that. So this really comes to the next step of due diligence, is taking your commitments and ensuring that your commitments are being applied throughout your value chain. And this is an entire due diligence process. It's not simply saying you've got a commitment. You need to be proving to the EU that these commitments are actually being applied throughout the value chain. So it's going above what is currently in due diligence legislation at the moment. And there will be, there will be enforcement bodies within the 27 member states. So the directive is going to require all 27 member states to have an enforcement body, whereas if you aren't complying, that there will be sanctions against the company. So really, you're taking your policies, you need to ensure that these policies are applying through audits, through due diligence, through assessments, throughout the value chain. It's simply not enough to have a policy committed to the OECD requirements without then checking that it's effective. And when we talk about effective, making sure that there is no forced labor in tier 5 of your value chain, or the higher risk aspects tend to occur in the tiers below 3, tiers 3, 4, 5. Really you do need to ensure that your policy commitments are being applied to these higher risk areas in the value chain as well, through audit and through assessments.
Thanks, James. There's another one. I'm just going to go back to the one above, but just another one that seems to link to this, which is that, can you show us an example of a management system that incorporates the new regs? I think I'll let you two answer, but I would say that we're really open to having conversations with anyone attending this webinar that needs extra specific information on your circumstances. Applicable to the last question and to this next one. As Elizabeth said, every company is unique and your value chain is unique to you. So this is what we do at TDI. We're there to make sure that we're getting it right for you. So please feel free to reach out to Elizabeth or James or info@TDI, just to make sure that you've got your details are being addressed specifically for that one. Was there anything else you wanted to answer in terms of showing examples of management systems? I think that's probably something for...
Yeah, I think that's, you can have a general approach to a management system like we highlighted on the wheel, a 1 to 6 step process. Really, that is an all-encompassing management system. But, it does go above that as well. And there are, every value chain, every supply chain is completely different. You might have a very simple supply chain, tiers 1s and tier 2s, as often is the case with perishable goods in agriculture. It goes direct from somewhere to the distribution centers. They're much shorter supply chains. The management systems would still have to be all encompassing for a shorter supply chain, as it would be for a more complex supply chain, like Elizabeth mentioned, with particularly electronics. They can be very complex supply chains. Fashion supply chains, cotton in particular, can be extremely complex with multiple tiers beyond tiers 5s. It would have to cover all of that. So it'd be difficult for me to provide a one-step solution, but certainly they would need to be customized for your value chain.
Great, thank you. We've got a few questions here about mechanisms. So we've got one here, which is, what is the mechanisms envisaged for enforcement? And about auditing specifically, which I guess is linked to the mechanism aspect. One here, we operate in the precious metal sector. If we are audited by a scheme recognised by the EU conflict mineral legislation, is that sufficient? So I guess it'd be interesting to hear about auditing, about mechanisms. How do you go about making that work? Elizabeth, do you want to elaborate on that for us?
Well, no, I'm just from first glance at that question. The EU conflict mineral legislation covers just one aspect of what the directive covers, right? So it's very much focused on conflict affected and high risk areas and human rights, whereas the directive is wider in scope. So it covers environment and climate change and a whole other range of topics. So from first glance, I would say that it's a great thing, great that you're being audited by that, but I don't think that would be sufficient specifically to show compliance with this directive.
Okay, that's helpful. And so just to go back to the mechanisms envisaged for enforcement.
Yeah. So I can answer that one. So each member state has to designate one or more supervisory authorities to supervise compliance with the due diligence requirements. So that has not been established yet. We're still in the tripartite agreement stage. Once it's been agreed by the Commission, Parliament, etc., that's when it gets designated to the 27 member states to impose in law. That is when each member state will be required to designate one or more supervisory authorities, whatever that may look like. It will be a specific to that country, however, and they will have the authority to investigate companies and enforce the actions of the directive on them.
So that's a watch this space one.
Yeah, what I'll say is, just as well, going back to the previous question, I know we've got 2 minutes left, but audits are not generally sufficient as well. It is only one part of a management system to detect risk. An audit alone is not sufficient to detect some of these risks, and actually an audit can be quite poor due diligence mechanism for detecting things like discrimination or forced labor, which are often hidden risks. So actually you would need to go back to your early steps, really identify what the key risks in your value chain are, and then ensure that you're deep diving those risks through an audit. And these sometimes one size fits all audit do not deep dive things like forced labor or discrimination, which are typically very poorly picked up through non-compliances in audit frameworks. So that is really very key, that an audit alone may not be sufficient to be compliant with the CS.
Thank you. I think that answers the question we've got here about the OECD 5 diligence process, which somebody has added. So I hope that answers that question. I'm just going to rush a little bit because we haven't got an enormous amount of time left. But so any details available on what defines companies operating in the EU for non-EU entities?
How do you mean the requirements for?
So I guess, yeah, I mean, if you are a non-EU entity, what does it mean to be operating in the EU? Is there any aspect of your value chain crossing into the EU that means that you're involved?
Yeah, as long as you've got 50% of your net turnover within the EU, you are categorized as being required to comply.
Okay. And one here, to what extent, in your estimation, do contractual requirements with suppliers shield a company from obligations regarding compliance further upstream? Should companies simply consider those contractual requirements as one layer, but that the company itself is still ultimately responsible for all impacts in all tiers of its supply chain?
Yes, to the latter part of that. I think, as James kind of stated before, it's not enough to simply have a policy in place, and a contract is a great way to go about this, but that isn't how you gauge risk, because if you are operating in a very, conflict affected area, just as a simple example, and you have a contract in place with your supplier there, that's not enough to ensure that there's not damage being done throughout that supply chain. So it's just one tool.
Yeah, and to add to that, contractual clauses are really useful as a if everything else fails, for remediation and mitigating the risks. It acts as a process for disengaging and risk disengaging. So it's an avenue to remove yourself from that risk. It is not in itself sufficient to address the risks.
And so final question from this list. So the impact of the directive will depend on the resources invested by national governments to its implementation and enforcement.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And back into that previous question.
And at the moment, that's we don't know how that will look currently. I imagine the end of this year we will.
we'll start to have more of a picture. Okay, thank you. I'll wrap up, but I just want to say enormous thank you to everybody who's attended, and all those wonderful questions, which just goes to show the scope of this is very far reaching, and it's going to have a lot of impact on many, many businesses around. I've got one more has popped in. Have we got one more time? Are you assessing the risk of climate change on supply chain? The risk of climate change on, that's a good question. Is the risk of climate change considered to be something that's going to be part of this scope?
Elizabeth, do you want to answer that?
I mean, yes, they do look at like greenhouse gas emissions and the environment. Yes.
Yeah, there is an aspect of climate
Yeah,
change.
an aspect of it.
Triple D.
Yeah. Okay. So just very quickly to wrap up, and a huge thank you to Elizabeth and James. I really appreciate your time and hard work that's gone into this. Just a reminder that we are there to support anybody who needs to discuss your reaction to this in whatever way you need. We have a wide range of services that support specifically offering, creating, making available data for due diligence. We have a speciality in creating digital tools that make data very easily available, tailored to what you need. So please reach out if that's of interest. It helps speed up your compliance process considerably. We also work on creating bespoke strategies for companies and on the whole suite of everything end to end of the value chain that's needed, including auditing. So take a look at tdisustainability.com to learn a bit more. And also, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask us if there's specific questions that you have, either to James or to Elizabeth, or through the Contact Us page on the tdisustainability.com website. We will be sharing this recording, a transcription and some selected slides over the coming week or so. So look out on the LinkedIn and Instagram, Twitter and YouTube channels for TDI for when that's available on the website. And also, we do further webinars coming up over the next patch of time, certainly before Christmas. We've got a couple which will be specific to fashion and to energy. That will be really relevant and are worth keeping an eye on. So thank you very much to everybody for your time today. I think, the last thing I wanted to say was there's a very short survey at the end of this, which will come up on the screen at the end when you sign out. And so if you would like to just give us some feedback, that's really helpful, and make sure that we're addressing everything that we've needed to address. And again, reach out if you have any questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.